He slammed the door without looking back. Behind him, the cold Texas wind howled through the dirt road like a warning no one wanted to hear. That night, a 4-year-old mother stood alone in the darkness, holding a worn Bible to her chest, asking herself one question she never thought she would have to ask. How did the son I gave my entire life to become the one who cast me out? She had fed him when she was hungry, worked until her hands bled so he could study, prayed for him every dawn before the sun touched the Texas horizon, and now she was homeless because of him. But what happens when a human heart reaches its cruelest moment, and heaven decides to respond? Because that night, in a forgotten place no one cared about anymore, someone sat beside her in the cold. And when morning came, everything had changed. This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about what happens when God steps in and rewrites a life from the ashes. Before we go any further, let me ask you something important. If you were standing on that dirt road in Texas and you saw an elderly woman pushed out of her own home in the middle of the night, would you stay silent, or would you step in? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that God still walks with the broken, the rejected, and the forgotten, make sure you subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. These stories aren't entertainment. They are reminders that no matter how dark the night becomes, God has not stopped moving. Now, let me tell you who this woman really was. Her name was Teresa Rodriguez. In the small stretches of West Texas, where the land is dry, the roads are quiet, and the wind never truly rests, everyone knew her face, even if few truly knew her story. Teresa was 74 years old, widowed for nearly a decade. Her husband, Miguel, had died suddenly of a heart attack after a long day working under the Texas sun. They had built their modest home together, board by board, on land that had belonged to her family for generations. It wasn't much, 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, cracked concrete floors, but it was filled with something rare: peace. Every morning before sunrise, Teresa would kneel beside her bed. A small wooden table served as her altar, an old Bible with yellowed pages, a rosary worn smooth by decades of prayer, and a faded image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. She prayed not for wealth, not for comfort, but for one soul alone, her son, Edward Eddie Rodriguez. She had raised him almost entirely on her own after Miguel's health began to fail. She worked cleaning homes, sewing repairs for neighbors, selling homemade food after Sunday Mass, anything that brought in a few extra dollars. When money was short, she ate less so Eddie could eat more. When his shoes wore thin, she mended them. When he wanted school supplies, she sold the only gold earrings she owned, her wedding gift. She never complained. When Eddie left for California in his early 20s, chasing opportunity and a better life, Teresa cried tears of joy. She thanked God on her knees, believing every sacrifice had been worth it. From that day on, her life became quiet. She wrote letters. She prayed harder. She waited. Eddie sent money when he could. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rare. But Teresa never questioned him. In her heart, he was still the little boy she had held during fevered nights, whispering prayers over his small chest. The house remained exactly the same, ample, humble, untouched by pride. Teresa didn't know that while her home remained rooted in faith and gratitude, her son's heart was drifting somewhere far more dangerous. She didn't know that shame had begun to replace love, that ambition had started to rot compassion, that the very life she had given him would soon become something he wanted to erase. And she certainly didn't know that a single night would undo everything she thought she understood about motherhood, sacrifice, and pain. But heaven knew, and it was already preparing to move. California changed Eddie Rodriguez, but not in the way his mother had prayed for. When he first arrived, everything felt larger than life. The buildings rose higher than anything he had ever seen in West Texas. The highways never slept. People walked faster, talked louder, dreamed bigger. Eddie told himself this was where he was meant to be. He started as a junior office coordinator at a construction and real estate firm on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The job wasn't glamorous, but it came with something he had never tasted before: status, business cards, meetings, co-workers who spoke about investments, brands, and weekend trips like it was normal. Slowly, Eddie learned a new language, the language of appearances. He bought clothes that carried logos instead of meaning. He laughed at jokes that mocked small towns and backward people. He stopped mentioning where he came from. When co-workers asked about his family, he kept his answers vague. "My mom lives somewhere in Texas," he would say, quickly changing the subject. At night, scrolling through social media, Eddie compared his life to others. Cars, apartments, vacations. He told himself he was behind, but catching up. He just needed more time, more money, more distance from the past. That distance hardened into something darker. Whenever his mother called, Eddie answered with impatience hidden beneath politeness. "Yes, Mom. I'm busy right now. I'll visit when I can." He stopped listening when she spoke. He stopped hearing the concern in her voice. The prayers she promised to say for him began to feel like an embarrassment, something old-fashioned, something he didn't need anymore. When his friends talked about their parents, Eddie stayed silent. Their families seemed modern, refined, respectable. His mother simple, religious, living in a worn-down house, no longer fit the image he was trying to build. And deep inside, Eddie began to resent her for it. He told himself it was harmless, just frustration, just growth. But shame is a quiet poison. It doesn't announce itself, it waits. The first time Eddie brought friends back to Texas, he felt it clawing at his chest the entire drive. The closer they got, the tighter his jaw became. The old roads, the empty fields, the dust. "This is where you grew up?" one of them joked. Eddie forced a laugh. When the house came into view, small, weathered, unchanged, his stomach dropped. Suddenly, he saw it not through the eyes of a son, but through the eyes of people he wanted to impress. The wooden porch, the chipped paint, the religious images on the walls, it all felt exposed. That night, sitting among laughter and alcohol, Eddie felt something snap. The life he had built in California collided violently with the life he had tried to bury in Texas. And instead of protecting the woman who had given him everything, he chose to protect his pride. He didn't realize it yet, but in trying to escape his past, Eddie was walking straight toward his reckoning. Because God is patient, but He is never absent. And when shame replaces love, heaven does not remain silent forever. That Saturday night in West Texas felt heavier than the others. The wind rattled the loose boards of the porch, and dust pressed itself against the windows as if the land itself were listening. Inside the small house, laughter spilled into corners that had only known prayer and quiet for years. Eddie sat at the table with two friends from California, men who wore confidence like armor and spoke as if the world owed them something. Empty bottles lined the counter. The air smelled of alcohol, sweat, and something else Teresa could not name, something sharp and unfamiliar. She moved slowly through the kitchen, careful not to intrude. Despite the late hour, she had warmed a pot of chicken soup, the same recipe she had made since Eddie was a boy, simple, nourishing, made with love rather than skill. "My son," she said softly, placing a bowl in front of him, "you must be hungry." Eddie didn't look at the soup. He looked at his friends. One of them smirked. "Man, this is rustic." Another laughed, nudging Eddie with his elbow. "Bro, you still eat like this?" Something twisted inside Eddie's chest. The words echoed louder than they should have. Rustic. Like a museum piece. Like something outdated and embarrassing. "I don't want that," Eddie snapped, pushing the bowl away so hard the spoon clattered onto the floor. "I'm not a kid anymore." Teresa froze. "I just thought," she began, bending to pick up the spoon. "I said I don't want your poor people food," Eddie cut in, his voice sharp, slurred, and cruel. "God, Mom, do you have any idea how this looks?" The room went silent for half a second. Then laughter. Not kind laughter. Not nervous laughter. The kind that wounds. Teresa felt it like a blow to the chest. Her hands trembled as she lifted the bowl and carried it back to the sink. She said nothing. She never did when Eddie raised his voice. Years of sacrifice had taught her silence more effectively than words ever could. But the night was not finished with her. As the hours dragged on, Eddie's friends wandered through the house, pointing at the walls, the furniture, the framed wedding photo of Teresa and Miguel. "Damn," one of them said, lifting the frame. "They look like they're from another century." "Put that down," Teresa whispered from the doorway. Eddie laughed louder than anyone. "She's dramatic," he said. "That stuff doesn't matter anymore." Teresa retreated to her bedroom, clutching her rosary with fingers stiff from cold and fear. She knelt by her bed, tears soaking into the thin carpet. "Lord," she prayed silently, "please protect my son. Please soften his heart." Outside her door, the laughter grew uglier. When the friends finally left, the house fell into a heavy, drunken quiet. Eddie stood alone in the living room, swaying slightly, staring at the walls as if they were accusing him of something he didn't want to face. In his clouded mind, a thought formed dark, convenient, irreversible. He walked to his mother's room and opened the door without knocking. Teresa looked up, startled, hope flickering for just a moment. "Eddie, are you all right, mijo?" His eyes were bloodshot, empty. "This is my house now," he said flatly. "Dad left it to me." Teresa's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you can't stay here anymore." His voice rose, fueled by alcohol and resentment. "I'm done being embarrassed. I'm done pretending this place is something it's not." She stared at him, waiting for a laugh, a correction, anything. None came. "Pack your things," Eddie continued. "You need to leave. Tonight." The silence that followed was unbearable. "Are you throwing me out?" Teresa whispered. "Out of my own home?" Eddie didn't answer. He pointed toward the door. Teresa stood slowly. Her knees ached. Her heart felt as if it were tearing open, but her voice remained steady. She picked up her old handbag. Inside she placed her Bible, her rosary, and the photo of her wedding day. Nothing else mattered. At the door, she turned back one last time. "May God forgive you," she said gently, "because I already have." Then she stepped into the cold Texas night, the door closing behind her with a final, hollow sound. And Eddie Rodriguez, standing in the house built by a woman he had just cast into darkness, had no idea that heaven had been watching every second, and that judgment, mercy, and redemption were already on their way. The door closed behind her with a sound that echoed far louder than it should have. Teresa stood on the porch for a moment, as if waiting for it to open again, for a voice to call her name, for a mistake to be corrected. Nothing happened. The wind cut across the open land, sharp and unrelenting, carrying the smell of dust and rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low, like a warning spoken too late. Teresa pulled her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders and stepped down from the porch, her old shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The dirt road stretched ahead of her, empty, dark, and unforgiving. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, no neighbors awake at that hour. Most of the town was asleep, unaware that a woman who had fed them, prayed for them, and served them quietly for decades was now walking alone into the night. Each step was an effort. Her knees ached. Her hands trembled. Her breath came shallow as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. Teresa leaned heavily on her wooden cane, stopping every few steps to steady herself. The wind pushed against her as if trying to turn her back, but she kept moving forward, guided by nothing but instinct and faith. "Where do I go, Lord?" she wondered. She thought of knocking on doors, of waking neighbors and explaining, confessing what had happened. But shame weighed heavier than exhaustion. How could she say the words out loud? How could she admit that her own son had cast her out? So she walked. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, soaking her hair and clothes within minutes. Her grip tightened around her bag, the worn leather slick in her fingers. The Bible inside pressed against her side like a quiet promise. Her thoughts drifted backward to Eddie as a child, running barefoot down this same road, laughing, calling for her. She remembered holding his hand when he learned to walk, staying awake all night when he was sick, whispering prayers over him when fear crept into his dreams. "Where did I lose you?" she asked silently. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing nothing but emptiness. The thunder that followed shook her chest, and for the first time, fear overwhelmed her composure. Not fear of the storm, fear of being forgotten. She slowed, her body growing weaker with each step. Her clothes clung to her skin, heavy with rain. Her shoes squelched in the mud. The night seemed endless. Then, through the curtain of rain, she saw it. The outline of a building, abandoned, silent, forgotten. The old bus station sat just beyond the edge of town, its concrete walls stained by time and neglect. The roof sagged, but it still offered shelter, something she desperately needed. With the last of her strength, Teresa made her way toward it. She collapsed onto a rusted metal bench beneath the overhang, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Her hands were numb, her lips trembled uncontrollably. She closed her eyes and clutched her rosary. "Father in heaven," she prayed, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I don't understand this pain, but I trust you. If this is where you want me tonight, then stay with me." The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold. Teresa did not know it yet, but this place of abandonment was about to become holy ground, because when the world turned its back on her, heaven was drawing near. The abandoned bus station felt like a place time had forgotten. Paint peeled from the concrete walls in long, tired strips. Broken glass crunched under Teresa's shoes as she shifted her weight on the rusted bench. Old graffiti names, dates, promises, no one kept covered the pillars where travelers once leaned while waiting for rides that would change their lives. Now, there were no travelers, only her. The rain hammered the roof above in uneven rhythms, dripping through cracks and splashing onto the cracked pavement below. Wind whistled through the open bays where buses once idled, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and oil. Teresa pulled her bag onto her lap and hugged it tightly, as if it were the last solid thing anchoring her to the world. Her hands were stiff with cold, her fingers slow to obey her thoughts. She took out her rosary. The beads were smooth, worn down by decades of faithful use. Each one held a memory, each prayer whispered in the dark, each plea offered when no one else was listening. She began to pray. "Our Father who art in heaven," her voice shook, cracking on the words. She paused, drawing in a breath that burned her lungs. The cold was settling deeper now, not just on her skin, but inside her chest. She continued, "Give us this day our daily bread." Her lips moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to stop, even as her body protested. The prayer steadied her heart, even as her body grew weaker. Time lost its meaning. Minutes blurred into something longer. The rain softened, then intensified again. Teresa's shivering slowed, not because she was warming, but because her strength was fading. She leaned her head back against the cold metal pole and closed her eyes. Memories surfaced uninvited. Miguel's laughter in their early years, Eddie's first day of school. The pride she felt watching him leave Texas, believing God had great plans for him. A quiet sob escaped her throat. "Lord," she whispered, "if I failed, forgive me. If I loved too much, forgive me. I only wanted him to be safe." Her breath came shallow now. Her eyelids felt unbearably heavy. She knew this feeling. She had seen it once before, years ago, when an elderly neighbor collapsed from cold during a winter outage. The stillness before danger. The deceptive calm. Teresa tightened her grip on the rosary one last time. "Lord Jesus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain, "if this is my last night, receive me into your arms." She paused. Then, with a mother's instinct that never truly fades, she added softly, "And please, forgive my son. He does not know what he has done." The words lingered in the air, fragile and sincere. Silence followed. Not the silence of abandonment, but something deeper, thicker, as if the space around her were holding its breath. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, steady, unhurried. Teresa's eyes fluttered open. At first, she thought it was her imagination, Another memory, another dream drifting through her weakening mind. But the sound grew closer. Someone was approaching through the rain. Her heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a strange, unexplainable calm. She lifted her head, squinting into the darkness. A figure emerged from beyond the reach of the station's dim light, tall, quiet, walking as if the storm did not touch him at all. And in that moment, when Teresa had nothing left to give, no strength to stand, no certainty of what would come next, she was no longer alone. Because heaven had heard her prayer, and it had come down to meet her exactly where she was. The man stepped fully into the light beneath the broken awning. Rain continued to fall around him, yet his clothes were barely damp, as if the storm itself respected his presence. He wore simple garments, a long, earth-colored coat, worn sandals, nothing that marked him as important by the standards of the world. And yet, everything about him felt weighty. He stopped a few feet from Teresa, looking at her not with curiosity, not with pity, but with recognition, like someone who had been waiting. "Cold night," he said gently. His voice was calm, steady, warm in a way that cut through the chill, especially for someone who has walked so far. Teresa tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She nodded faintly, pulling her sweater tighter around herself. The man sat down beside her on the rusted bench. The metal should have been freezing, but where he sat, Teresa felt a warmth begin to spread, slow and deliberate, as if heat were returning to her bones. He placed a small cloth bag at his feet and opened it. Inside was bread, not wrapped in plastic, not store-bought, fresh, still warm. He broke it in half and handed her a piece. "Eat," he said softly. "You need strength." Her hands trembled as she took it. The first bite stopped her breath. The taste brought tears to her eyes, not because it was extraordinary, but because it tasted like home, like safety, like mornings long gone. From the bag, he took out a metal thermos and poured her coffee into a small cup. Teresa stared. "There's cinnamon," she whispered. He smiled, just slightly. "The way you like it." Her heart began to race. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How do you know what I like?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her hands. That's when she noticed them. His wrists. There were marks there, faint, old, but unmistakable. Scars shaped like nothing she had ever seen except in paintings, except in her Bible. Her breath caught. The man met her eyes. And suddenly, she knew, not with her mind, but with her soul. "You have carried more than most," he said quietly. "You carried a child through hunger so he would not starve. You carried loneliness so he would not feel alone. You carried shame that was never yours to bear." Tears streamed freely now. "I prayed," Teresa whispered. "Every morning, every night. I asked God to protect him. I asked him to soften his heart." The man nodded. "I heard every prayer." Her entire body trembled, not from cold, but from awe. "I was there," he continued, "when you knelt before dawn, when you sold what little you had so your son could have more, when you forgave, again and again, without being asked." He placed his hand gently over hers. The warmth surged through her, chasing away the numbness, the pain, the fear. The rain still fell, but it felt distant now, powerless. "Your sacrifice was not invisible," he said, "and it was not wasted." Teresa could barely breathe. "My son," she whispered, "he hates me." "No," the man said firmly. "His heart is hardened, but it is not lost." She looked up at him, desperate. "Will he ever come back?" The man's gaze softened. "He will fall," he said. "Everything he built on pride will collapse. And when he is broken enough to see clearly, he will return." Her voice broke. "And when he does?" The man leaned closer. "You must do what my father has always done," he said. "You must forgive." Teresa nodded, tears soaking into her scarf. "I already have," she whispered. A smile, gentle, sorrowful, wholly touched his lips. "Then sleep," he said. "Morning is closer than you think." Her eyes grew heavy. The exhaustion she had been fighting finally released its hold. As she drifted into sleep, she felt something placed around her shoulders. Warm, protective, and the last thing she heard before the world faded was his voice, low and full of promise. "You were never alone, Teresa. And tomorrow, everything will be different." Sunlight touched Teresa's face gently, as if afraid to wake her too quickly. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. The cold was gone. The deep ache in her joints had eased. Warmth surrounded her. Not the brief warmth of relief, but something lasting, steady. She opened her eyes. The abandoned bus station was still there. The cracked concrete, the rusted pillars, the peeling paint. But something was different. A clean wool blanket was folded neatly around her shoulders, tucked in with care. Beside her, resting on a flat stone as if deliberately placed, was a manila envelope and a small set of keys tied together with a simple wooden tag. Her heart skipped. She sat up slowly, looking around. The bench beside her was empty. No footprints. No sound. No sign that anyone had been there at all. Except for what he had left behind. With trembling hands, Teresa reached for the envelope. Her name was written on the front, in calm, deliberate handwriting. Teresa Rodriguez. She slid her finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside were documents, official papers, stamped and signed. She didn't understand all the words, but she recognized enough to feel her breath catch in her throat. Property deeds, county records, maps with highlighted boundaries. At the top of one page were words that made her knees weaken. Recorded owner, Teresa Rodriguez. Her mind raced. This couldn't be right. She had never gone to a county office, never signed paperwork, never spoken to a lawyer. And yet, there it was. Her name, her signature, clear, undeniable. Her signature looked exactly like hers. Tucked beneath the documents was a handwritten note. She unfolded it slowly. "The house was always yours, and there is more you were never told. What was hidden has been restored." Tears blurred her vision. She clutched the papers to her chest and whispered, "You did this." The keys trembled in her palm as she stood. One key looked familiar, the front door to her home. Others she didn't recognize. Teresa stepped out from under the awning and began walking back toward town, the morning light revealing puddles left behind by the storm. Birds sang from the fences. The wind felt gentler now. As she passed through the quiet streets, shopkeepers began opening their doors. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" a voice called. She turned to see Mr. Callahan, the local bakery owner. "What are you doing out so early?" Teresa smiled, a smile she hadn't felt in years. "I'm going home," she said simply. "To my house." Something in her voice made him nod without another question. When she reached the property, Eddie's truck was gone. The house stood silent. The door was locked, but when she tried the key from the envelope, it turned smoothly. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. The walls, the table, the small altar. She went straight to the old metal box where family papers were kept. Her hands shook as she opened it. There it was. An older deed, yellowed with age transferring ownership of the land from her parents to her upon marriage. Beneath it, newer documents revealed something she had never known. The surrounding land, nearly 2 acres, had always belonged to her family, and just 3 days earlier it had been legally updated, rezoned for residential development, and registered entirely in her name. The value printed on one assessment made her gasp. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Teresa sank to her knees on the cracked floor. "You fixed what I didn't even know was broken," she whispered. She bowed her head, tears falling freely. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed. "I don't know why. You chose me, but I receive this gift with humility. Use it for your glory." As sunlight filled the room, Teresa felt a certainty settle in her heart. Her life had not been spared for comfort. It had been spared for purpose. And somewhere far away, a young man named Eddie Rodriguez was about to learn that heaven had moved and nothing would ever be the same again. While Teresa was kneeling on the floor of her home in West Texas, giving thanks for a miracle she could barely comprehend, her son was hundreds of miles away, unaware that the ground beneath his own life was beginning to give way. California no longer felt victorious. Eddie Rodriguez sat at his desk in a beige office cubicle, staring at a computer screen that blurred in front of his eyes. Numbers didn't line up the way they used to. Emails went unanswered. Deadlines slipped past him like ghosts he pretended not to see. His supervisor had noticed. "Eddie, everything okay?" she asked one afternoon, leaning against the doorway. "You've been off lately." He nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." It was a lie, but not one he understood yet. At night, sleep refused to come. When it did, it was shallow and restless. He dreamed of the Texas house dark, silent, of his mother standing outside the door, rain soaking her hair, her eyes filled with something worse than anger. Forgiveness. He woke with his heart pounding and guilt clinging to him like sweat. At work, the mistakes multiplied. A misfiled contract. A missing document. A deadline missed by days. What once would have been small corrections now carried weight. During a staff meeting, his manager's voice turned sharp. "This can't happen again," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "People depend on this work." Eddie lowered his gaze. 2 weeks later, he was called into a conference room with glass walls. Human Resources sat on one side of the table. A folder lay open between them. Due to repeated errors and compliance issues, the HR representative said carefully, "We're terminating your position, effective immediately." The words landed without sound. Eddie walked out carrying a cardboard box filled with what remained of his professional identity: pens, papers, a framed certificate he had once been proud of. The parking lot felt too bright, too exposed. He called his friends that night. No one answered. Messages went unread. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One afternoon, he ran into Mason, the same friend who had laughed the loudest in Texas outside a coffee shop. Eddie raised a hand in greeting. Mason hesitated. "Look, man," he said, lowering his voice. "People talk." Eddie frowned. "About what?" "About what you did," Mason replied. "Your mom." Eddie stiffened. "That's family business." Mason shook his head. "No, that's character, and we don't want to be associated with that." The words struck harder than any insult. For the first time, Eddie was alone, not just physically, but socially, emotionally, spiritually. Bills stacked up quickly. Without income, his savings evaporated. He sold his television, then his designer clothes. Finally, he stood in a pawn shop holding his father's old watch, the last thing of real value he owned. $50, the clerk said without looking up. Eddie closed his hand around the watch. "No," he whispered, backing away. "I'll keep it." He walked out into the street, chest tight, head spinning. Without planning it, his feet carried him somewhere familiar yet long ignored. A small church stood between two storefronts. Good Shepherd Parish. Eddie paused at the door, unsure why he was there. But something inside him, something broken and desperate, pushed him forward. As he stepped inside, the noise of the city faded. And for the first time since that night in Texas, Eddie Rodriguez began to feel the weight of what he had done, not as shame, but as the beginning of repentance. The church was quiet. Not the heavy, intimidating silence Eddie had expected, but a gentle one, like a pause meant for breathing. Sunlight filtered through narrow, stained-glass windows, casting soft colors across the worn wooden pews. Eddie sat in the last row at first, unsure of himself. He hadn't been inside a church like this in years. The smell of old wood and candle wax stirred memories he hadn't invited Sunday mornings in Texas. His mother's hand resting on his shoulder, her whisper reminding him to bow his head. He swallowed hard. At the front of the church hung a simple wooden cross. No gold, no grandeur, just Christ's arms outstretched, eyes lowered in suffering and mercy. Eddie stared at it longer than he meant to. Slowly, without quite knowing why, he moved forward and sat in the first pew. His chest tightened, his throat burned. "I don't even know if you're listening," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty space. "But I've lost everything." The words spilled out uncontrollably. "My job, my friends, My pride." He paused, breath shaking. "And my mother." Tears fell freely now. "I threw her out," he said, pressing his palms against his eyes. "The woman who gave me everything. I treated her like she was nothing." His shoulders shook. "I don't know how to fix this," he confessed. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't live like this." Footsteps echoed softly behind him. Eddie turned to see an elderly priest approaching from the side aisle. His hair was silver, his posture slightly stooped, but his eyes were clear and attentive. The priest sat beside him without a word, allowing the silence to stretch. "I'm Father Anthony," he said finally. Eddie nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You didn't," the priest replied gently. "You came seeking truth. That's never a scene." Eddie hesitated, then told him everything. The drinking, the shame, the night in Texas, the words he wished he could take back. When he finished, he waited for condemnation. It never came. Instead, Father Anthony spoke softly. "You know the story of the prodigal son?" he asked. Eddie nodded. "The son lost everything before he remembered who he was," the priest continued. "And before he returned home, he didn't fix his mistakes. He only did one thing." "What?" Eddie asked. "He went back." Eddie's voice cracked. "But how do I face her, after what I did?" Father Anthony placed a hand on his shoulder. "Repentance begins when we have the courage to look directly at the damage we caused," he said. "You cannot receive forgiveness if you never ask for it, and you cannot ask if you keep running." Silence filled the space again. "Go home, Eddie," the priest said firmly. "Not to defend yourself, not to explain. Go to kneel, go to ask." Eddie closed his eyes. "I don't have money for a bus," he admitted. Father Anthony smiled slightly. "God will provide the road." Eddie stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve firm. As he stepped back outside, the California sun felt different, less blinding, more honest. He didn't know what waited for him in Texas. He only knew this. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't running toward success. He was walking toward truth. And the long road home had finally begun. The road back to Texas felt longer than Eddie remembered. He stood on the edge of the highway with his thumb out, the California sky burning orange as the sun sank behind the hills. Cars passed without slowing. The wind pushed dust into his eyes, and each passing minute gave fear more room to grow. What if she won't see me? What if I'm already too late? Hours later, a pickup truck finally pulled over. The driver didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Eddie climbed in, clutching his backpack like a lifeline, staring out the window as the city gave way to open land. By the time he reached West Texas, night had fallen. The town looked smaller than he remembered, quieter. Streetlights hummed softly, casting long shadows across familiar roads. With every step toward the old house, Eddie's heart pounded harder, as if it were trying to escape his chest. He prepared himself for the worst. A dark home, boarded windows, a silence that would confirm his greatest fear. But when he turned the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was glowing. Warm light spilled from the windows, illuminating the porch and the yard. Fresh paint caught the light, clean and bright against the night. And beyond the house, where there had once been empty land, he saw movement, construction lights, tools, men working quietly, even at that late hour. Eddie's mouth went dry. This isn't possible. A wooden sign stood near the front gate. He stepped closer, reading the words slowly, afraid they might disappear if he blinked. Divine Providence Senior Home, opening soon. His legs nearly gave out. With trembling hands, he knocked on the door. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a young woman in a nurse's uniform. Her smile faded the moment she saw his face. "I'm looking for Teresa Rodriguez," Eddie said, his voice barely holding together. "My mother." The nurse studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Wait here." The door closed. Eddie stood frozen, his heart racing, sweat breaking across his forehead despite the cool night air. He heard voices inside. Movement. Then silence. The door opened again. And there she was. Teresa stood in the doorway, framed by warm light. She looked different. not younger, but lighter. Her clothes were simple yet new, her hair was neatly pulled back, and her eyes, those eyes that had last looked at him through tears, were calm, alive with peace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eddie's strength gave out. He dropped to his knees on the concrete porch, the sound echoing in the still night. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "Mom, I'm so sorry." The words poured out of him, tangled and desperate. "I was cruel. I was blind. I treated you worse than anyone deserves. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see everything." He pressed his forehead to the ground, shoulders shaking. "I lost everything after that night. And I deserved it. But losing you, that almost destroyed me." Teresa watched him silently. Behind her, the nurse crossed her arms, tense, ready to intervene. But Teresa raised a hand gently, signaling her to wait. Eddie looked up, tears streaking his face. Teresa stepped forward. She placed her hand on his head. "Stand up," she said softly. He obeyed, barely able to meet her eyes. "That night," Teresa began, her voice steady, though emotion shimmered beneath it, "I thought I would die. I was alone, cold, and broken." Eddie flinched. "But I didn't," she continued. "Because I wasn't alone." She took a breath. "Jesus came to me." Eddie froze. "He sat beside me. He fed me. He told me you would return broken, just as you are now. And he told me what to do when that moment came." Her voice trembled now, but her resolve did not. "He told me to forgive you." Tears filled Eddie's eyes again. "So, my son," Teresa said, pulling him into her arms, "I forgive you." The night seemed to hold its breath. Eddie clung to her like a child, his sobs muffled against her shoulder. And as mother and son embraced on that porch where rejection had once reigned, something ancient and holy was restored. The long road home had ended, and a new life, built not on pride but on grace, had just begun. Eddie stayed in Texas. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't make promises about the future. He simply stayed because for the first time in years, running no longer felt like freedom. The morning after his return, he woke to the sound of voices outside the house. Not angry voices, not arguments, but the steady rhythm of work hammers striking wood, footsteps moving with purpose. Construction. Teresa was already awake, just as she had been his entire life. She stood near the kitchen window, watching workers prepare materials on the land that had once been empty and forgotten. "What is all this?" Eddie asked quietly. Teresa smiled, not proudly, but with clarity. "It's what God entrusted to me." Over cups of simple tea, she told him everything. The bus station, the man who came in the storm, the envelope, the land that had always been hers, the money that followed. "But this isn't about money," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. "It's about what we do with it." She explained her vision. A home for elderly men and women who had been abandoned, forgotten, or had nowhere left to go. A place where dignity would not be earned by wealth or status, but given freely. Eddie listened in silence. "I want to help," he said finally. Teresa studied him carefully. "Not as a boss," she replied. "Not as a savior." Eddie nodded. "As a servant." And so he began. He carried lumber, cleaned floors, painted walls. He learned the names of every worker and thanked them personally. When paperwork was needed, he handled it. When supplies were short, he drove hours to find what they needed at lower cost. No one recognized him as the man who had once kicked his mother into the night. They only saw a quiet, hard-working son. Word spread through the town. Women from the church brought meals. Teenagers volunteered on weekends. A retired nurse offered to help train staff. Even the local doctor agreed to stop by once a week, free of charge. The house changed. New rooms took shape. Clean beds were assembled. Bathrooms were renovated. A small chapel was added near the back of the property, modest but reverent. Teresa walked through each room slowly, imagining the people who would one day sleep there. She prayed over every doorway. "May this be a place of peace," she whispered. The first residents arrived quietly. An elderly man who had been living in his truck after his son stopped returning his calls. A woman whose family had passed away, leaving her alone in a trailer with no heat. Another who had simply outlived everyone who once loved him. They arrived unsure. They stayed transformed. Eddie watched it all with humbled eyes. Each night after the work was done, he and his mother sat on the porch beneath the Texas stars. They spoke little. Words weren't necessary anymore. He knew now what he had despised. Her faith, her patience, her love, they were not signs of weakness. They were strength refined by sacrifice. And as the home filled with life, Eddie felt something new growing inside him, not ambition, purpose. What had begun as a miracle was becoming something far greater. It was becoming a mission, and neither of them yet knew how far that mission would reach. The morning the white rose appeared, no one heard it arrive. There was no sound of digging, no footsteps on the soil, no voice calling attention to the miracle. It was simply there. Eddie was the first to notice it while walking across the yard just after sunrise. The Texas air was still cool, the kind of quiet that settles before a long day begins. Near the old lemon tree, one that had survived decades of drought and neglect, stood a rose bush that had not been there the night before. He stopped. The roses were white, not pale, not fading, but pure, as if light itself had taken the shape of petals. Dew clung to them, shimmering softly, and the fragrance that filled the air was unlike anything he had known. It reminded him of fresh bread, and something sacred he couldn't name. "Mom," he called out. Teresa came slowly, her cane tapping gently against the porch boards. When she saw the rosebush, she froze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her hand went to her chest. "It's him," she whispered. Eddie looked at her. "You're sure?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes, not of fear, but of recognition. The same presence, the same peace. Later that day, one of the elderly residents spoke quietly while sitting nearby. "I saw a man early this morning," he said, "wearing simple clothes. He was tending the soil. When I asked him who he was, he smiled, and then he was gone." Others confirmed it. A figure in the early light, a warmth that lingered after he left. The rosebush never withered. Seasons changed, summer heat, autumn winds, winter cold, but the flowers remained, white, fragrant, alive. No gardener could explain it. No soil test made sense of it. And Teresa refused to turn it into spectacle. "This is not for profit," she told visitors gently. "It's a reminder." Every morning, residents gathered near the roses to pray. Some touched the petals, some simply sat nearby, breathing in the scent, feeling perhaps for the first time in years seen. The home became known not for its miracle, but for its love. Months passed, then years. The property expanded. More rooms were built. More elderly men and women found refuge within its walls. And in each new courtyard, Teresa planted a cutting from the original rosebush. Every cutting took root. Every one bloomed. Eddie changed too. He became known not as the man who once fell, but as the man who stayed, who served quietly, who listened more than he spoke, who carried the weight of his past not as shame, but as testimony. One evening, sitting beside his mother under the stars, Eddie spoke softly. "I used to think wealth was what I could build," he said. "Now I know it's what I almost destroyed." Teresa smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the windows behind them. "The love you despised," she said gently, "was the treasure you were missing." Years later, when Teresa's body finally grew tired, she passed peacefully, with her rosary in hand and a faint smile on her lips. That night, the scent of roses filled every room of the house. Eddie stood beneath the white rose bush long after the others had gone to sleep. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us." The rose did not answer, but it bloomed. And in its quiet persistence, it told the story better than words ever could, that forgiveness outlives cruelty, that love multiplies when it is given away, and that, when heaven steps into human brokenness, the signs it leaves behind do not fade. As this story comes to an end, I want to invite you to pause for just a moment, not to think about Teresa, not to think about Eddie, but to think about your own heart. Is there someone in your life who loved you before you ever deserved it? Someone who prayed for you when you walked away? Someone whose love you may have ignored, minimized, or even wounded? This story reminds us of a truth that is hard to face, but impossible to escape. The love we despise is often the greatest treasure we will ever be given. Eddie believed success was status, distance, and pride. Only when everything collapsed did he discover what real wealth looks like: forgiveness, humility, and a love that refuses to give up. And maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you feel like Teresa, forgotten, rejected, wondering if your prayers still matter. Or maybe you feel like Eddie, carrying regret, shame, and the fear that it might be too late to make things right. Hear this clearly: it is not too late. God still sees, God still hears, and God still steps into the darkest places when no one else will. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to do 3 simple things. Leave a comment and share what part spoke to you most. Subscribe to Heaven Walks with Us for more stories that remind us we are never alone. Share this video with someone who may need hope, forgiveness, or a second chance. And if you're carrying a burden right now, leave a prayer request in the comments. This is a community that believes in miracles, not just yesterday, but today. Remember, no heart is too hard, no mistake is too final, and no night is so dark that heaven cannot find you. Thank you for walking with us. May God bless you and guide your steps forward.